Never underestimate the quietest person in the room. They might just be the one who's the most dangerous. That statement echoed through the streets as the sun began to set, casting long shadows down a quiet alley where the unexpected would unfold. And as the minutes ticked by, no one could have imagined how wrong they were about the quiet twins that had just entered the scene. Nia and Naya Blackwell were not your typical young women. On the outside, they were two ordinary sisters who blended in effortlessly in any crowd. Yet, beneath their calm exteriors, there was a storm waiting to be unleashed, a storm shaped by years of intense military training, covert missions, and a bond that was unbreakable. The world had no idea who they really were. Born and raised in Houston, Texas, Nia and Naya shared more than just a birthday. They shared a dream, an unyielding drive to serve their country, to protect and to fight back against injustices of every kind. But their story wasn't going to be written with words. It was going to be written in blood, sweat, and tears, over the course of missions so dangerous they'd be classified. Both were elite members of an undisclosed Special Forces unit, highly trained in combat, strategy, and survival. Their skills were honed in the harshest conditions imaginable, turning them into forces to be reckoned with. What many didn't realize was that their unassuming demeanor, soft voices, calm smiles, and polite nods, was the perfect disguise. But tonight that disguise would shatter. It all started with a confrontation, one that would change their lives forever. As Nia and Naya walked down the street, heading towards their favorite diner, they didn't anticipate the trouble brewing ahead. They had faced racism before, sure. The taunts, the stares, the condescending remarks, they'd grown used to it. But nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. They were about to face something far worse. A group of men stood outside the diner, their laughter filling the air. They were your typical bullies, the kind that thought nothing of belittling others. And as Nia and Naya passed by, they couldn't help but make their presence known. "Look at these two," one of the men sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "You two lost? You know this isn't a place for your kind, right?" The sisters kept walking, ignoring them at first. They had learned long ago that responding only gave people like this the satisfaction they craved. But one of the men wasn't satisfied. He stepped in front of them, blocking their path. "Not so fast," he said, a smirk on his face. "What are you, some kind of soldiers? Bet you couldn't even make it through basic training?" His words dripped with venom, the racial slur hidden behind his fake smile. Nia's fists clenched at her sides, but she said nothing. Naya, however, didn't have the same restraint. Her voice was calm, but the fire in her eyes was undeniable. "You have no idea who you're talking to," she said, her tone ice cold. The man laughed, stepping closer to the sisters. "What's this? A tough girl act? You think I'm scared of you? You don't belong here, so why don't you just keep walking and go back to where you came from?" But it didn't stop there. More men gathered around, circling the twins, shouting insults, making jokes about their appearance, their heritage, their very existence. It was like the worst kind of nightmare come alive. They taunted the sisters with racial slurs, making crude jokes about their skin color, their hair, their clothing. The usual hate. Naya's patience wore thin. She could see the situation escalating quickly, and there was only one way this would end. Nia caught her sister's eye, and in that silent moment, they both knew what had to be done. They had been trained for this, trained to handle confrontations, to be calm under pressure, to fight when necessary. But they weren't just going to fight for themselves. They were fighting for every person who had ever been looked down upon because of their race, their gender, or their background. They were fighting for respect, for dignity. Without a word, Naya stepped forward and, with precision, swept the man who had blocked their path off his feet. He hit the ground with a loud thud, groaning in pain. The others froze, staring at the sisters with wide eyes. For a brief second everything went still. "Now, are we done here?" Naya asked, her voice cool and steady. But they weren't done. The men, their pride wounded, advanced toward the sisters with renewed aggression. They pulled out weapons, brass knuckles, chains, knives. But the sisters weren't fazed. They had faced enemies far more dangerous than this. What happened next no one expected. In the blink of an eye, Nia and Naya moved with deadly precision. In seconds they disarmed their attackers, their swift, coordinated movements leaving the men struggling to keep up. Just as they were about to finish the fight, one of the men, desperate and enraged, reached into his jacket. The sisters didn't hesitate. They sprang into action, disarming him before he could pull out the weapon. That's when the real shock came. Out of nowhere, a group of police officers arrived at the scene, their guns drawn. They'd heard the commotion and assumed the worst. "Freeze. Get on the ground," one of the officers barked, his finger hovering over the trigger. The officer's eyes scanned the scene, landing on the sisters who were still standing unshaken. The officers, unaware of who they were dealing with, shouted commands, instructing them to get on the ground. The twins didn't move. They didn't have to. They were Special Forces operatives and they were about to prove just how far they could go. As the officers shouted and threatened, a man from the crowd, someone who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward. His eyes widened in recognition, his mouth hanging open in shock. "Wait, you two. You're the Blackwell sisters, aren't you?" The officers froze, eyes narrowing in confusion. The situation was suddenly very different. And just as the officers were about to question the identity of the twins, one of the gang members, still reeling from the earlier defeat, launched himself at Naya. The sudden movement caused chaos to erupt once more. The question remained, would the twins make it out of this situation unscathed, or was this just the beginning of a much darker confrontation? The officers, now wary but still uncertain, kept their weapons trained on Nia and Naya. The tension in the air was thick, and the twins' calm composure only seemed to heighten the sense of unease around them. Their hands remained by their sides, but their eyes were sharp, scanning every movement, every shift in the crowd. This wasn't their first time facing down dangerous situations, but tonight was different. Tonight they weren't just fighting against the bullies on the street, they were fighting a system that didn't understand them, didn't respect them, and didn't know what they were truly capable of. The man who had stepped forward to recognize them was still standing in the background, his face filled with disbelief. His words echoed in the twins' minds. "You're the Blackwell sisters." It wasn't just a name, it was a symbol. A symbol of fear for those who crossed them. A symbol of hope for those who needed protection. The Blackwell sisters were known in certain circles as the best in the business, the ones who got the job done, no matter how tough the mission. They had saved lives, exposed criminal syndicates, and protected their country from threats that no one even knew existed. They were the epitome of dedication, sacrifice, and strength. But to the police officers standing in front of them, they were just two black women in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Who are you?" one officer demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and confusion. His finger remained on the trigger, still unsure of whether or not to use it. "Do you want to know who we are?" Nia's voice was steady, her tone laced with an edge that demanded attention. "Because we're the people you should be thanking. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for us." The officer's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't fire. The crowd around them had started to murmur, some recognizing the twins' faces, others whispering to each other in disbelief. The tension was reaching a boiling point, and Nia and Naya knew they needed to defuse it before it escalated further. One of the men from the group who had attacked the sisters earlier, still bruised and battered, limped toward the officers. His face was bruised, his shirt torn, but his eyes were filled with hatred. "They're the ones who started it. They attacked us," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at the twins. "They're dangerous. They're the ones who—" Before he could finish, Naya stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone commanded respect and everyone could feel it. "No one started anything. You attacked us first. You disrespected us because of the color of our skin," she said, her voice cold but powerful. "We only defended ourselves." The officer's eyes darted between the gang member, the twins, and the rest of the crowd. He seemed to be weighing his options, unsure of what to do next. "Get on the ground," the officer barked, directing the order at Naya. "Both of you. Now." Nia's heart raced, but she remained calm. They had been in worse situations before, but this one felt different. The looming threat of authority hung heavy over them, and they knew that no matter how much they defended themselves, there was always a risk of being misunderstood, or worse, punished for their actions. But before Nia or Naya could react, a voice called out from the back of the crowd. "Stop. They're telling the truth." The voice was familiar. It was the man who had recognized them earlier, the one who had stepped forward in shock. He pushed his way through the crowd, his hands raised in an attempt to calm the officers. "They're not just anyone," he continued, his voice now desperate. "They're Blackwell sisters. They're elite. Special Forces operatives. You can't just treat them like this." The officers froze, their expressions shifting from hostility to uncertainty. The name Blackwell had power that not many could understand. And while the officers processed this new information, the gang members began to stir, realizing that they had made a grave mistake. It was then that Naya, ever the tactician, made a decision. She took a small step back, her eyes never leaving the officers. "Look, we don't want trouble," she said softly, her tone still commanding. "We're just trying to get out of here without any more problems." But just as things seemed to be settling down, one of the gang members, now enraged by the revelation that the sisters were special forces, lunged forward, throwing a punch at Naya's face. The blow was wild, reckless, and filled with rage. The officer closest to Naya didn't have time to react. And in one fluid motion, Naya ducked, grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground in an expert takedown. She was on top of him before he could even react, her knee pressing into his back, her hand holding his wrist at an impossible angle. The officer who had been holding his gun now shouted, "Stop! Get off him!" But Naya didn't move. "You have 5 seconds to get control of your men," she said coldly, her eyes not leaving the officer. "Or this is going to get a lot worse." The officers hesitated. The crowd watched in stunned silence, some now realizing who the Blackwell sisters really were. It was at that moment that Nia stepped forward, pulling her sister back just as the officer, finally regaining his composure, raised his gun in a threatening stance. "Don't do it," Nia warned, her voice steady and firm. "We don't want to make this any worse." And for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. This could either end in chaos, or it could be the beginning of a very different kind of battle. The officers, unsure of how to proceed, were caught between their duty and the stark realization that they were dealing with something far more complicated than they could have ever imagined. Will the Blackwell sisters be able to defuse this situation without further conflict? Or will their secrets be exposed, sparking a chain of events that will change everything? If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. This story is just getting started. Stay tuned, and let's find out what happens when the most elite Special Forces operatives face off against not just a gang, but an entire system of power and prejudice. The standoff between Nia and Naya and the officers seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with tension, everyone unsure of how to proceed. It was as though time itself had slowed down, each second dragging on endlessly as the officers weighed their next move. One of the officers, a younger man with nervous energy radiating from him, kept his gun trained on the twins. His finger twitched, uncertain. He'd never been in a situation like this before, never faced someone who could disarm and neutralize a man in mere seconds. His training had never prepared him for a threat like Nia and Naya Blackwell. He had only ever been taught to deal with street criminals, never with elite operatives. Another officer, older and more experienced, spoke in a calm but stern tone. "Lower your weapons. We need to get this situation under control." The younger officer hesitated, clearly confused. His eyes flickered between the twins, still processing the realization that they weren't just ordinary civilians. They were special forces, trained to fight and survive in the harshest environments. They had seen things, done things that most people would never imagine. The older officer slowly holstered his gun, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Who are you really?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Naya released the man she had pinned to the ground, and he scrambled away, still nursing his bruises. She didn't give him a second glance. Her attention was now solely on the officers. "We're just two sisters," Naya said evenly, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Two sisters who've had enough. Enough of being attacked. Enough of being threatened. Enough of being treated like we don't belong." The crowd stood motionless, their eyes glued to the unfolding drama. The fight was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The younger officer, still processing everything, stammered, "But, the Blackwell sisters? You're really them?" The twins exchanged a glance. They didn't need to say anything. The recognition was enough. The name Blackwell wasn't just a name, it was a reputation. A reputation that preceded them even when they didn't want it to. Nia spoke up this time, her voice quieter but no less intense. "Yes, we are the Blackwell sisters. But we don't wear the uniform anymore. And we don't take orders from anyone." The older officer sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to make sense of everything. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but the truth was undeniable. There was no way they could be just ordinary civilians. These were women who had been trained to kill with a single breath, who had taken down terrorists, who had executed dangerous covert operations all over the world. And now they were standing in front of him, two black women with no regard for the system that was supposed to protect them. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" the younger officer asked, his voice softening. "Why let this get so out of hand?" Naya's gaze hardened. "Why would we? You should have figured it out by now. You didn't ask. And when you don't ask, you make assumptions. You assumed we were just two black women walking down the street. But you didn't know who we really were. That's the problem." The officers fell silent, the weight of her words settling heavily in the air. The younger officer seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, But the older one remained skeptical, his posture stiff, his mind still processing. The gang members, on the other hand, were already starting to retreat. They had underestimated the twins and now, they wanted nothing more than to disappear into the night. But as they turned to leave, Nia's voice rang out, stopping them in their tracks. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded, her voice sharp. One of the men turned, a sneer plastered across his face. "We're done here. You won. Happy?" But Nia's expression remained cold, calculating. "Not yet. You've got some explaining to do." Nia and Nia were used to the typical harassment, the catcalling, the racial slurs, the dismissive comments. But what had happened tonight was more than just a series of insults. This had been a calculated attack. A gang of men, united not by their hatred for the twins but by their belief that they could get away with anything. They believed the sisters wouldn't fight back. They believed they could intimidate them. But now the tables had turned. The sisters knew they couldn't let this go. Not without ensuring that the men who had attacked them, who had attacked others like them, faced the consequences. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. With a swift movement, Nia reached for her phone and began dialing a number, her fingers tapping quickly against the screen. "We're going to need backup," she muttered under her breath. The older officer, still unsure of what to do, stepped forward. "You can't be serious. You're going to involve the authorities?" Nia looked him dead in the eye. "You think we're going to let them walk away? You think we're going to let this slide?" The officers exchanged a glance, but neither of them moved to stop her. The younger officer, now visibly uncomfortable with the unfolding events, shifted on his feet. "We didn't ask for this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We were just doing our jobs." "And so were we," Nia shot back, her tone hard. "But our jobs are to make sure people like them don't get away with this. And right now you're in the way." The gang members, realizing that their chance to escape was slipping away, started to panic. One of them tried to make a run for it, but Nia was already moving. In the blink of an eye, she tackled him to the ground, pinning him down with one swift motion. The man struggled beneath her, but she held him firmly, her strength unyielding. "Not so fast," Nia said, her voice low but filled with authority. The other gang members stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with fear. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control. The officers, now caught between their duty and their growing realization of who they were dealing with, stood helplessly at the scene. As Nia finished the call and turned back to the men, her eyes locked onto the one who had started the whole mess, the leader of the gang. He was no longer smirking. The bravado had drained from his face, replaced by sheer terror. "You wanted trouble?" Nia said softly, her voice colder than the night air. "Well, you've got it." And just like that, the entire situation teetered on the edge of disaster. The game had changed and no one, not the officers, not the gang, and certainly not the twins, knew how this was going to end. The chaos was building, and Nia and Nia could feel the tension rising with every passing second. The streets were starting to clear as the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation now kept their distance, unsure of what would happen next. The officers remained frozen, unsure how to handle the situation, while the gang members were visibly panicking, realizing they had pushed their luck too far. Nia's phone call had been short but to the point. She had contacted the only person who could help them resolve this, someone with the authority and influence to make sure the gang was held accountable for what they had done. But even with reinforcements on the way, the feeling in the air was thick with uncertainty. This wasn't just a routine arrest. This wasn't just another case of street thugs messing around. No, this was something bigger and everyone could feel it. "Let them go, Nia," Nia said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "We don't need to make this harder than it has to be." Nia glanced down at the man she had pinned to the ground. He was struggling, trying to squirm out from under her grip, but her hold was unbreakable. He was a mess, bloodied, bruised, and terrified. His fear was palpable, his eyes wide and desperate as he stared up at the sisters, realizing just how much trouble he was really in. But Nia didn't budge. "They've been allowed to terrorize people like us for too long," she said, her voice filled with determination. "This ends tonight." The older officer, who had remained mostly silent up until this point, finally spoke again. "You don't have the authority to keep them here," he said, his voice strained. "If you don't let them go right now, I'll be forced to arrest you." Nia turned to face the officer, her expression impassive. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the uncertainty, the confusion. He wasn't used to seeing women like them in positions of power, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. "We're not going anywhere," Nia said quietly, her voice low but strong. "We've earned the right to be here. We've earned the right to fight back." Naya released the man she had pinned to the ground, and he scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting nervously between the officers and the twins. The gang members were now on edge, unsure whether they should try to escape or face the consequences of their actions. The younger officer, still visibly shaken, spoke up. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice pleading. "We can let this go. Just walk away." "Walk away?" Naya repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "After everything they've done? After everything they've put us through?" The man she had taken down was now standing up, still trying to catch his breath, his eyes wide with fear. His gang was no longer looking as confident as they had been just moments before. The power had shifted and they knew it. Nia stepped forward, her posture unyielding. "No. We're not letting them go. Not until they understand that there are consequences for what they've done." A deep silence settled over the scene. The tension in the air was thick and everyone, officers, gang members and onlookers, felt the gravity of the moment. The decision had been made. The fight was no longer about the officers or the gang, it was about something much bigger. It was about standing up against racism, against injustice, and against a system that had failed too many for far too long. Just as the situation reached its boiling point, sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder by the second. Reinforcements were on the way. But even with backup arriving, Nia and Naya knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. They had to make sure the gang members understood that their actions had consequences. They had to make sure that the officers realized that this wasn't just about arresting criminals. This was about changing the narrative, about proving that they weren't going to sit back and be intimidated any longer. The gang members who had been so confident moments ago were now cowering. The leader of the group, still bruised and battered, stepped forward, his voice trembling as he spoke. "You're not going to get away with this. You think the system is going to let you walk? You think the cops are just going to let you go?" Nia and Naya exchanged a glance. They knew the system. They knew how it worked. They had fought it for years in ways most people would never understand. But what the man didn't realize was that the system wasn't always as powerful as it seemed. Sometimes, the people who had the power were the ones who were willing to fight back. "We don't care what the system thinks," Naya said, her voice cold. "We don't care what anyone thinks. We're done waiting for someone to fix this. We're fixing it ourselves." The sirens grew louder, and within moments, a group of black-clad officers arrived at the scene, their uniforms crisp and their faces stern. These were no ordinary officers. These were the ones who had been called in by Naya to ensure that the gang members would be taken into custody and held accountable for their actions. As the new officers took control of the situation, Nia and Naya stepped back, watching as the gang members were cuffed and forced into the back of a police van. The older officers, those who had been at the scene first, stood to the side, unsure of what to say. They had witnessed the Blackwell sisters in action, and there was no denying it anymore. They were a force to be reckoned with. The younger officer, still wide-eyed, turned to Nia and Naya, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you really?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. There was no need to respond. They had already shown everyone exactly who they were. As the last of the gang members were taken away in the van, Nia and Naya shared a brief look. They had won this round. But the battle was far from over. The world was still full of people who thought they could intimidate, belittle, and abuse others without consequences. The Blackwell sisters had only just begun to fight back. And as the sirens faded into the distance, Naya spoke, her voice low but filled with resolve. "This is just the beginning." The night was far from over, and Nia and Naya knew it. Despite the victory they had claimed in the streets, a sense of unease settled deep in their bones. They had faced down a gang of racists who thought they could terrorize anyone they wanted, but there was still so much more to fight. They knew this was just one small battle in a war that would never truly end. As the last of the police vans pulled away, the sisters stood in silence for a moment, watching the flashing lights disappear into the distance. The crowd that had once gathered to witness the spectacle had long since dispersed, leaving behind only the echo of their murmurs and the faint rustling of the wind. Naya spoke first, her voice quiet but resolute. "We're not done yet." Nia nodded, her gaze focused on the empty street ahead. "I know. But we've made an impact tonight. We've shown them that we're not going to back down." They were right. They had made a statement. The gang would face consequences, and those consequences would ripple through the community. The officers at the scene were now aware of who the Blackwell sisters really were. They weren't just two black women trying to survive in a world that often overlooked them. They were powerful, skilled, and unyielding. And that was a force to be reckoned with. But as much as they had hoped that tonight would be the turning point, they knew better. The reality was that racism, discrimination, and hate ran deep in the streets, in the systems, and in the hearts of far too many people. Tonight's fight was just the beginning. They were only scratching the surface. The sisters began walking in the direction of their car, their footsteps quiet against the pavement. The cool air hung around them, but it was more than just the chill of the night, it was the weight of what they had just been through. As they approached their car, Naya's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A name flashed across it, one that made her blood run cold. Derek, Naya muttered, her tone laced with both recognition and caution. Derek was someone they both knew all too well. He was a contact in the intelligence community, a man who worked behind the scenes, always in the shadows, making deals and gathering information. They had worked with him before, but they knew that his connections were often more trouble than they were worth. Still, he had always been useful when they needed him. But now the fact that he was calling them at this hour didn't sit well. Naya answered the phone, pressing it to her ear as she continued walking. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by Derek's gravelly voice. "You two have caused quite a stir tonight." Naya's jaw clenched. "What do you mean?" "You've made more than just a mess in the streets," Derek said. "I've been getting calls. People want to know who you really are. And you've got some very dangerous people paying attention to you now." Nia, who had been listening intently, stepped closer to her sister. "What kind of people?" Derek hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to share the information. "People who don't take kindly to what you've done. The ones who pull the strings behind the scenes. The ones who think they own everything, everyone. They're looking for you." Naya stopped in her tracks, her grip tightening around the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Who?" "The ones you've pissed off," Derek replied, his tone now serious. "And they're not going to let this slide. You two are on their radar now. They don't care who you are or what you've done in the past. You're a threat, and they'll do whatever it takes to neutralize that threat." Naya's eyes narrowed as she looked at her sister. The pieces were falling into place now. This wasn't just about the gang anymore. It was bigger. Much bigger. "You need to get out of town," Derek warned. "Now. Before things get worse." Naya shook her head, her face set in determination. "We're not running?" Derek sighed. "I'm not telling you this because I think you'll listen, but you need to understand that you're in danger. You've stirred up something that you can't just walk away from." The line went dead before Naya could respond. She looked at Nia, who was already staring at her with the same resolve in her eyes. "You heard that?" Naya asked. Nia nodded slowly. "Yeah. We're already too deep. They know who we are now." "It's not just the gang," Naya said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet rage. "We've made ourselves a target. And we're not backing down." Nia placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. "We don't have a choice." They both knew the stakes had just been raised. It wasn't enough to fight on the streets anymore. Now they were up against a shadowy network of people who would stop at nothing to silence them. But the twins weren't about to back down, not when the fight had just gotten started. As the sisters slid into the car and drove off into the night, the reality of what lay ahead settled in. The road would be dangerous. But for Nia and Naya, the choice was clear. They would continue the fight no matter who was watching, no matter who was hunting them. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been pushed down, insulted, or abused. It was about making sure that the world knew they would not be intimidated. And as they drove into the unknown, one thing was certain. The battle was only beginning. The quiet hum of the car engine was the only sound as Nia and Naya sped down the empty roads. The weight of everything they had just learned hung heavily between them. Derek's words were still ringing in their ears. A shadowy organization with far-reaching power and influence was now aware of their existence. And they weren't going to let the sisters walk away without a fight. As they drove through the city's darkened streets, Nia's grip tightened on the wheel. "We can't just keep running. We need to hit them first. We need to send a message." Naya glanced over at her, her eyes hard and unwavering. "I know. But where do we start? These people, whoever they are, they're connected to everything. We can't just go after them head-on." They had always been trained to think strategically, to plan every move carefully. But the situation had changed. Now they were no longer playing defense. They had become the target of something far bigger than themselves. Something that had the resources to track them down, manipulate systems, and eliminate threats without a second thought. "We start with their weak points," Nia said, her voice steady as she turned onto a new street. "We find out who they really are, what they're hiding, and we destroy it. We go for their people, their operations. And we do it fast." The twins had been part of covert missions before, infiltrating enemy lines, gathering intel, and executing precision strikes against high-value targets. They knew the risks. They knew that their lives were now in constant danger. But they also knew something else, that they were far more dangerous than anyone realized. They had been trained for this moment. And they weren't about to back down now. As Naya pulled out her phone, she quickly began typing, scanning through old contacts and files. "I've got a few people we can talk to," she said, her tone focused. "We can't do this alone. Not if we want to stay one step ahead." "We don't need to stay ahead," Nia replied, her voice fierce. "We need to strike first. The moment we show any hesitation, we lose." As the sisters prepared for what was ahead, the city around them seemed to fall into a deep, unsettling silence. The world at that moment felt small. Their mission, their fight, felt larger than ever. But just as they reached the edge of the city, a car pulled up behind them, headlights blindingly bright in their rearview mirror. Nia's instincts kicked in. She slammed her foot down on the accelerator, pushing the car faster, but the car behind them mirrored their every move. It wasn't long before the pursuing car pulled up alongside them, and through the tinted windows, Nia could just make out the shape of a man in the passenger seat, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Nia's voice was sharp as she reached for the seatbelt. "We've got company." Before Nia could respond, the car beside them swerved into their lane, forcing them to swerve and narrowly miss an incoming truck. The tires screeched as Nia veered the car out of harm's way, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't going to let them get away with this. "Hold on," Nia shouted as she made another sharp turn, trying to shake their pursuers. But the other car was relentless, staying on their tail no matter how fast they went. Nia grabbed the glove compartment and pulled out a small but powerful handgun. She checked the clip quickly, then leaned out the window, taking aim at the tire of the car following them. "Ready when you are," Nia said calmly, her gaze steady as she lined up the shot. Nia gave her a nod. "Take the shot." The sound of the gunshot rang out, sharp and clear in the quiet night, and the pursuing car swerved, its back tire blowing out. But the driver wasn't finished yet. The car slid dangerously but managed to regain control. "We need to end this now," Nia said, her voice urgent. "We can't keep running." The car pulled alongside them once again, and this time the man in the passenger seat leaned out the window, holding a gun of his own. Before Nia could react, the car lurched violently as the man fired at them. The bullet grazed the side of the car, missing Nia by inches. She could feel the heat of the near miss as it passed. Without missing a beat, Nia swerved the car toward the other vehicle, ramming it hard on the side. The impact was enough to send the pursuing car careening into a streetlight, its front end crumpling as it slammed into the pole. Both cars came to a screeching halt, and for a moment, everything was still. Nia and Nia quickly got out of their car, weapons drawn, ready for whatever came next. They approached the wreckage cautiously, their eyes scanning the area, alert for any movement. From the wrecked car, a figure staggered out, his shirt torn and bloodied. The man was clearly disoriented, but he still tried to raise his gun. Nia reacted in an instant, her reflexes sharp as she aimed at the man's wrist, disarming him in a single shot. "Who sent you?" Nia demanded, her voice cold and calculating. The man staggered back, his face twisted with pain and fear. "You don't understand," he gasped. "They're everywhere. You can't hide. You've made a mistake. You don't know who you're messing with." Nia took a step forward, her voice low and menacing. "We know exactly who we're messing with. And we're not backing down." The man, now visibly terrified, fell to his knees. "They're watching you. You'll never be safe. You'll never escape them." But Nia and Nia weren't listening anymore. They didn't need any more threats. They were beyond that. They had made their decision, and nothing, no one, was going to stop them now. As they turned to walk away from the wreckage, the man's final words echoed in their minds. "You've made a mistake. They will come for you. And there's nowhere you can run." But the sisters didn't flinch. They had already faced the worst the world had to offer. And they would keep fighting, until the very end. The road ahead was uncertain. But as long as they stood together, no one could break them.